It is with pleasure that we introduce you to the latest presentation of the literacy bug, entitled The Alphabetic Code, or Mastering the Code. And the focus here will be on how these squiggles on a page, also known as letters, come to be combined to represent words that we know, and how the technological insight of our forebears were able to see those phonetic divisions within our language and being able to represent those phonetic elements through what we now call as letters, and how a child comes to grasp onto this abstract symbolism and use it to manipulate something for a long time, which is language. And then how we as adults, particularly literate adults, look at print and seamlessly see language in it, almost effortlessly. So as with our previous presentations, you can download the slides that I'll be going through from the literacy bug. You can either download those before watching the video or after watching the video for review. So without further ado, what are the objectives? So in the next bit of time, we're going to explore why it's important for learners to develop an understanding of the patterns in their speech, such as phonemic awareness, in order to reliably recognize and get their head around sound and letter patterns, and to understand how words work in general, as well as how print words work. And we'll outline all the key elements of, quote, the code, such as phonemic awareness, phonemic knowledge, letter-sound correspondence, orthographic patterns, morphological patterns, and automatic word recognition and construction skills, let alone putting that all together to form sentences and to form texts, or to read sentences and read texts with comprehension and critical thinking. And we'll also emphasize a key critical goal, which is we want learners to execute the code and word recognition skills with sufficient automaticity so as to facilitate more complex acts of comprehension and composition. The more fluid and fluent one is at merely engaging with the code and with reading, the more time there is to facilitate inference making, critical thinking, summarizing, synthesizing, discussion, and evaluation. And we must understand one thing that about language skills. That language skills such as vocabulary and syntactic competence, or the ability to follow the logic of a sentence, become stronger and stronger predictors of reading comprehension as word reading skills are consolidated. So once we take care of word reading skills, we still want to make sure that learners are being exposed to richer and more diverse vocabulary and being able to follow the logic of more and more complex sentences and texts. So mastering the code is an essential component within literacy, but in and of itself isn't sufficient. So there's just 5 quick sections to this. There's a very quick introduction. Then we'll look at Adam's model of the reading system. And we'll look at something more contemporary, which is the dorsal ventral shift hypothesis. Then talk about the elements of the code and conclude. So I'll try not to labor too much over each of those sections. Now please note, in this presentation I won't be focusing on recommended teaching activities in any detail. I will point to some, and I will point to some videos online that allude to and are good models of teaching practices. However, we're going to focus upon teaching activities in detail in other presentations. So instead, this presentation will be focusing upon how code-based skills fit within the context of language and literacy development. Okay, without further ado, the introduction. And I'm going to start with a quote that I think really captures what we're talking about. Starting in the middle of the page, the beginning reader's initial task is to learn how the spoken language that they know relates to the written code that they are learning. And what I love about this quote from Mark Seidenberg is it emphasizes that the learner, let's imagine a child. They have a language. They have a vocabulary. They've been talking for many years. They've been moving from one-word utterances to two-word sentences and three-word sentences, and moving into asking more complex questions, asking why, learning and pointing at things to know what things are called, practicing with rhyming games, with vocabulary searches, with I Spy games, etc. They're developing this rich spoken language that they know, that's part of them. And this becomes critical motivation to do what they see their parents do, perhaps when reading a book, is the parents point to these squiggles on the page, these print words. And in some way, every time they read a book, whenever the parents point to that particular printed word, they say the same thing. And so they start to draw this connection that these words represent, these printed words represent words in the language they know. And so the motivating factor is, how can I see language in the code? And then that becomes a very long process of knowing how the English language in print works. So bringing print and speech into alignment is what makes reading feasible. And so what I love about that quote is also represented in a YouTube clip that I recommend you explore. It's from Children of the Code, and it's merely called The Language to Literacy Continuum. And it emphasizes that children come into the world learning language, and as they learn language, before the critical step before learning literacy is to start to understand how the language they know in any way correlates to the squiggles on the page. And so that continuum, and I'll go to the next slide, focuses on some key points. And at the risk of being repetitive, the first point is developing language skills is key, including vocabulary, syntax or grammatical control, and discourse development. Having conversations, being able to tell a story, being able to tell a recount, being able to read context, and to use language effectively within context. Now, for literacy, of equal importance is the development of phonemic awareness, which is the ability to detect sounds within words, such as b, a, t, for the word bat. And what's important there is that the ability to break up that word bat into three sounds, b, a, t, isn't necessarily acquired as part of language development. One can become a competent language user without knowing or without clearly detecting sounds within words. I don't need to break up the word bat into b-at to use that word amongst friends, amongst others, or the word help or hello. There's not a necessity to unpack and break up words into their component parts to be understood or to understand from others. That's in some ways the gift of the language learning brain. Is it takes those pulses of sound, bat, help, red, green, and it merges all those sounds together without conscious awareness to focus upon what it means. However, to become literate, one actually has to unpack a word into each component sounds and understand how letters and letter combinations come to represent those sounds. So the step of understanding how words are composed of syllables, of sounds, etc., is part of phonemic awareness. And from there, one requires a number of years to become proficient with reading and writing words. Now, matching sounds, as we said before, to letters or sound letter patterns is only one aspect to form words. A learner in English must also navigate and remember the patterns and rules and exceptions in English orthography. Because English is considered what we call opaque orthography. It's not as there's lots of rules and exceptions. There's lots of different forms, different ways to represent a single sound. However, even beyond being able to decode and understand sound and letter patterns, we'll need to reach some form of automatic word recognition in order to become fluent. We need to have enough experience with familiar and known words and enough alacrity with being able to quickly decode unfamiliar words so that we can read with enough fluency to be able to process and comprehend what we read. So language is important, phonemic awareness is important, decoding skills is important, but also automaticity and fluency. And that is essentially a key part of the birth to age 9 or age 8 challenge. Or even younger. I think Marianne Wolf has this lovely quote, which it said that it took 2,000 years for humankind to develop the invention of print or a phonetic alphabet, and it requires a child 2,000 days from birth to be able to master it. So let's look at this concept within Adam's model of the reading system. For the risk of being repetitive, start off with what's the first component? Language. And again, a Seidenberg quote, "We read with our eyes, but the starting point is speech." So if one becomes a great decoder, but they don't have a rich vocabulary or rich models of using language, then in the long term, the child will struggle. So in this example we have here, someone yells out, "Help, fire." It's said within some context, has some meaning imparted into someone, and I want to express a message. Now, it becomes more clear here when we say that the language system itself is made up of a lexicon, which means a vocabulary base, lots of words, and a syntax, a logic of how to put those words together to express to others or to understand a message or an idea, and some context in which that message is understood in order to extract meaning. And that translates over to an individual here who not only is meant to gain the sense of what has been said, so the picture in their head, but also the intention and the meaning. And so speech, as here Seidenberg writes, is messy. To produce a coherent message is quite complex. We need to decide what to say. We need to pick the words and the grammatical structures to express that meaning, load it all together, run that program either within the brain or also to express it, and hopefully the intention that we hope with our message is made. So the reading system adds another dimension, which is down here. So not only do we need to know the word fire, but we need to also have a phonological processor and an orthographic processor. So a phonological processor is that phonemic awareness side of the equation, in which I need to be able to break up this word that I know into component parts. And then I also need to know the rules, the conventional rules of this language, this phonetic language, print language that I'm learning, so that I can draw a correlation between the sounds that I'm hearing and the letters that are meant to represent those sounds. So for here, this word fire, I have verbal rehearsal. I say it over and over again in my head, fire, fire, fire. Hold that in working memory. It also has that feedback loop. And so as I slow myself down, what are the sounds in fire? F, I, f, I, hold that in working memory, because then I'll have to process that and say, oh, what's the letter that makes the f sound? Oh, that's the F. What's the letter that can make the I sound? Oh, letter I. What's the letter that makes the sound? And I might write F-I-R, but then another processor hits my brain that says, that would be fur. For me to say fire, I need to use the silent E rule. I put the silent E on the end, and I have fire. In writing, I'd have to look at that, based upon those rules, break it down into its parts, and go, I know what that means. Now, what we'll see later on with the ventral shift hypothesis is, in the early years, a child and a teacher is relying a lot on the phonological processor to support that orthographic processor. But as one becomes automatic and fluid with their reading, one doesn't necessarily need to sound out every word that they see. The orthographic processor processes that visual information, retrieves that word from memory, and goes, oh, I know exactly what that word is. I can automatically process it without having to physically sound it out. I might sub-vocalize it, or that might be sounded out and processed unconsciously in my brain, but I might be going straight from the orthographic processor to the meaning processor. So similarly here, once I've read it, I need to switch attention from decoding to, now that I know what I've read, I need to imagine it, conceptualize it, and get its sense and meaning. And here's just another example of the same thing. The word spoon. Break it up. Phonological processor, spoon, spoon. Phonemic awareness, matching it with the letters that represents those sounds. And those associations, those mappings, is what we learn over time, what we teach children over the time. But what we want them to do that is continue integrating that into words that I know, that represent things that I know, and I can do something with that newfound knowledge. And so if we look at the elements of the code, to summarize, we've got language, we've got phonemic awareness of this word spoon. I know the word, that's a whole spoon. I break it up into parts, spoon. But then not only am I aware that this word has sounds, but I have phonemic knowledge. For me, there's a concept. I know what the s sound is, something distinct. It's not just a sound, but it's a sound I know, and I know it's part of a limited number of sounds in the English language. P, u, n. And then my phonic knowledge is to say, what's the likelihood that the s sound is made by the letter S, and so on, until I join that together for automatic word construction or recognition. And the process also works the other way for decoding. I see that word, I broke it up into its chunks or patterns based upon my statistical knowledge of how that language works, and I say it out loud. So, learning to read is a process of acquiring several types of statistical knowledge that supports rapid and efficient comprehension, starting with phonological structure of the language that I know, orthographic structure of the letters and the letter combinations that I am learning, the mappings between orthography and phonology, joining those in order to recognize vocabulary, putting that vocabulary together by grammar to excitingly make statements about the world and also understand statements of the world, and deficits in any of these areas are of critical significance if we're going to focus upon literacy development in the long term. So, but in the end, eventually people manage to be good at reading without knowing much about how they do it. So once you learn to ride a bike, you forget that at one stage it was laborious and hard and difficult. It's become part and parcel of your skill set, because most of what goes on in reading eventually is subconscious for those who have learned to read with a great amount of fluidity. So we are aware of the results of having read something, that we understood it, that we found it funny, that it conveyed a fact or a feeling or an idea. We soon, with good learning, are not aware of the mental and neural operations that produces good reading. When you watch a child learning to read, you can see the mental and neural exertion that occurs, but it's in fact beneficial that we forget that ever occurred when we learned to read. So we don't become automatic from the get-go. Becoming virtually automatic does not happen overnight. The circuits of becoming a great reader are created through hundreds or even thousands of exposures to letters and print. So, let's talk about a little bit of a more recent research that talks about what is going on in the brain when one makes that neurological shift from highly dependent upon that phonological processor to being able to, with enough experience, quickly and automatically recognize a corpus of vocabulary, which will indeed help with fluency. And that's the dorsal ventral shift hypothesis. And basically what it means is that it proposes that there's a developmental shift from a reliance on sounding out words implicated in sound symbol matching, and you have to sound it out laboriously until you go, ah, I recognize that word. I might have read it before, but I still had to read it out loud, but now I recognize it. And then there's a shift to the brain actually recognizing it rapidly from a visual stimulus. So rapid word recognition implicated in the automatic retrieval of familiar vocabulary. So, and in many ways, I'm picking up on this theme because I don't want to labor over the whole language and phonics-based debate. But one argument within the whole language or whole word debate is eventually we have to read whole words, words at a time. And this research points out to say, yes, eventually what's most efficient is that we're not decoding even subconsciously each word at a time, but we're recognizing that that visual form is a pattern that I know. But we can't get to that phase until we've actually gone through the dorsal. We'll call that the ventral phase. But we can't get to that phase until we've gone through the sounding out phase, the phonological processing phase, which is the dorsal phase. Okay, so the dorsal circuit. The dorsal circuit, which is, we have here, the eye sees the word, laboriously sounds it out basically based upon their understanding of phonological structures and orthographic patterns, and they go, wow, I know that word. I've got a picture in my mind. I just read the word book, but I saw k, book. Oh no, I know that one. And there's an excitement of, wow, I just read that word, and it's something that I know. So that dorsal temporal circuit is, you have here, I'll leave it for you to read if you're reading on the screen, lots of references to the neural structure of the brain. These structures are primarily involved in phonologically processing and integrating the visual, the orthographic letter shape forms with auditory or phonological information, known as phonological decoding or sounding out. And that happens a lot within the young reader's sort of brain. Whereas the ventral system is when I look down, I see it, and my brain goes, that's book. And it might even say book, I hear book in my head, but I'm not physically sounding out because almost like a reflex, my eye immediately recognizes that as a word that I know. So the ventral system is processed is critical for fast automatic processing of visual word forms. And this pathway tends to be used for words that are frequent. So in other words, we have to read what might be familiar words in our oral vocabulary, but we need to read them a number of times in the dorsal phase to reinforce them enough so that they've been pushed into the ventral phase, which relies on a combination of stimulus experience, seeing the word, with memory retrieval. So while both the dorsal and ventral streams are used throughout lifespan, the dorsal to ventral shift hypothesis proposes that children rely more on the dorsal stream processing for all word types before shifting to a reliance on the ventral stream for automatic word recognition. But you can't skip a step. Strong phonological decoding skills are necessary for the children to develop the ventral stream for reading. So children who went on to improve their reading abilities had a sufficiently strong connection between orthographic word forms and their relationships with sounds before they made a shift away from using that sounding out mechanism or the dorsal stream processing neurologically. And in fact, there's also research that points that adults who continue to rely upon the dorsal stream processing are much less effective and are often struggling readers who struggle with comprehension and processing large amounts of text. So reading skill is related to using the correct pathway for the word being read for the mature reader. key point here for that mature reader. So for unfamiliar words, we all still need to see it, sound it out, and check in our brains whether we know that word, or if we don't, checking another resource. But for most words that we encounter in text, for familiar words, we see it, and our brain responds by retrieving that almost effortlessly from memory, and then integrating all the other data that's required for comprehension, such as where it fits within a grammatical structure, where it fits within a text, our background knowledge, an understanding of the purpose of our reading, and then we start looking at what's amazing about both language and literacy is the parallel processes that go into reading meaningfully. So, in conclusion, for that ventral shift hypothesis is that beginning readers need to develop strong skills in developing their phonological understanding of language and their understanding of sound-letter combinations, and to have plentiful opportunities to use this knowledge to recognize and construct words. And if I add there, not only construct words, but construct sentences and to interpret sentences in many ways, also scaffolded by visuals that assist with meaning. Effective readers must transition, though, at some stage into a state where they're able to automatically and rapidly process words visually as they read more and more fluently and with comprehension. And so with experience, the systems become more efficient, and language is immediately seen in the script. So let's go to this main section, which in many ways will synthesize what we've been discussing so far, and that is, what are the elements of the code? So we would have seen this diagram before. So as we said before, the elements of the code include language, phonemic awareness, phonemic knowledge, alphabetics and phonics, as well as word construction and automatic word recognition skills. On the half of language, every time we use language, we get better at it. We learn more words, we have greater experience putting those words into sequences of syntax, and we get rewarded by being able to get reinforcement by others. So language, like everything else, the more we use it, the more adept and skillful we become at it. And nice thing is we have lots of models often in our linguistic community to be able to prompt us to become better at it. So if you're curious, there's a YouTube link here. It's a Wittgenstein video, who is one of my fans on the philosophy of language. But the image here is just to say that as we talk, we have this vain hope that pictures in our head can be understood by the person listening, and that we can share versions of the world with one another, whether it's memories, whether it's hopes, whether it's economic plans, etc., through these auditory pulses that come out of our mouth and then into someone else's ear. It's pretty amazing that anything can be understood at all. But what I do want you to potentially visit is this link about the 30 million word gap, because whilst I mentioned that we all benefit from having a linguistic community that serve as models for our language, it's not always true that everyone has the same richness and variety in the linguistic community that they're part of. Some amazing research done by Betty Hart and Todd Riesly, which is summarized in the video that's linked, talks about a significant gap in language experience that occurs between impoverished households and more affluent households, which affect vocabulary size and language skills and abilities upon the entry of kindergarten. And so the 30 million word gap is to suggest that between the most impoverished and the more affluent, there can be a 30 million word gap. And that's not meaning that there's a difference of 30 million vocabulary. What it means is one child might have experienced 30 million more words. They were spoken to more. They had more role play type activity, they had a lot more language enrichment than a child in a different environment. And that's going to have a heavy impact upon school readiness as well as literacy readiness because it impacts the corpus of language and vocabulary that a child will be drawing on when they start to see the patterns in print. So we need to have, as we talk about the code, simultaneously lots of activities in which children are having opportunities to have scaffolded language development and practices. So a key theme that's been throughout this presentation. So in addition to language, as we said before, phonemic awareness, seeing those components within a word, and phonemic awareness has different levels to it. So the levels here are as I'm a learner, I've just heard a sentence, the helicopter flew over the house. I can count the number of words in that oral sentence, and someone might ask me, what was the second word of the sentence, the helicopter flew over the house? And I can say, oh, helicopter. Okay, that's my second phrase there. I could recognize a word within a sentence. How many syllables are in the word helicopter? Okay, helicopter. Okay, within the first syllable, what's the first sound? Hel, he. What's the second? What's the third? For the second syllable, hel, and so on, breaking down, and this what we'd call this level is fully segmented into phonemes. And you can see from here then the step of introducing letters is quite clear, because I say, well, what makes the h sound of the letter H? What makes the sound? A little more difficult with vowels, letter E, and this is the learning part, is one needs to be able to first break up oral language into their component parts and then start to see what are the letters that represent these sounds that I'm hearing of these words that I know. So the crux for phonemic awareness is that first children need to listen, detect rhyme, isolate words within sentence, be aware of syllables, be able to detect initial and final sounds, isolate individual phonemes, and introduce letters and spelling. And for those who download the slides, what I put at the bottom here are the developmental milestones in which we'd expect a learner to acquire these skills. So we don't acquire these skills from birth, but over time, children start to aware to rhyme. They start to be able to count syllables. They start to be able to blend sounds. And so that is a key skill that develops both prior to school, but also in the early years of schooling. And so this is a example video activity on phonemic awareness. The only thing I'd point to here is if you look in the picture, there's a picture of a pin, and there's 3 boxes here. And this is a move it, say it activity. So what the teacher would do is move the green box over for the children and say P, yellow box I, blue cube N, P, I, N, pin. And you can notice here that at no stage for these children is this teacher introducing letters, because we're first focusing upon the concepts of sounds, and later on we can focus upon the concept of the letters that come to represent those sounds, but it's rooted in words that I know, and exploring words that I know and becoming competent in the patterns in the words that I know. So in addition to phonemic awareness is phonemic knowledge. So a video that I also recommend is The Sounds of English, followed by where different sounds are produced in the mouth, because becoming multisensory aware of sounds within articulation are important to be able to draw distinguishing features between what would be considered similar sounds. So let's take here the sound and the sound. Just auditorily, or just listening, you'd say that those sounds are very similar. But if you pay attention, and this video helps, you'll notice that the sound is made mostly through the lips, whereas the sound, the tongue sits behind the teeth. And so this is an example of, also in a video that I recommend, it's a similar one. The teacher will be demonstrating to the children for them to become aware, when you make that sound, what's happening? Is air coming out of your mouth? Or are your vocal cords vibrating, etc.? And this next video even further represents, and I like the title of it, is Sound Scientist. How do I become a sound scientist, in which I become curious of what's happening when I make the first sound in the word pin? What's happening in my mouth when I go p, p, p? Lots of air. Is my throat vibrating? P. No. So where is that sound being produced? That's a key part of not only phonemic awareness, but also what I call phonemic knowledge. And so these are the 44, 45, give or take one or two sounds in the English language. And one of the statistical challenges of learners in the early stages is intuitively or with instruction to work out some of the common percentages. They're like, as they explore words, they can realize that if I hear the sound, that there's a 95% chance that it will be made by the letter M. Whereas if I go to vowels, if I hear the E sound, as in the long E sound, the likelihood that it will be represented by the letter E might be only 70%. Whereas if I hear the A sound, as in cat, it's 96% chance that it's going to be represented by the letter A. And so this is sort of what's happening in the child's brain. If we look at the diagram again, as I hear this word fruit, and I know that there's a f, u, t. Those are 4 sounds within it, and I recognize that one sound's the f sound, and there's a 78% chance that it's going to be represented by the letter F. I hear the sound, there's a 97% chance that it's going to be represented by the letter R. I hear the sound, and there's a 38% chance that it's going to be represented by the letters OO. But in fact, 38% is the most likely percentage of that sound. So what that tells us is there's lots of different competing options that might also make the sound, as in blue is the is spelled with a UE or an EW, etc. And so there's a lot more ambiguity there, whereas the T sound is 97% spelled by the T sound. And so I could be phonically or phonemically right to spell fruit F-R-O-O-T. It's with understanding conventional spellings and the rules, and I go back to convention, that I learned that no, whilst that could be phonemically logical, it's actually spelled fruit with the UI. And so invented spelling fruit with 2 O's, is actually still critical. So before children attain a conventional level of spelling, they use what they know about the phonology and orthography of English to create novel spellings of words. And we almost want them to take risks, because the more that they take risks, the more that they learn about those patterns. So these invented spellings provide a window into their developing awareness of the alphabetic principle. So going back to our diagram, after we look at language, phonemic awareness, phonic knowledge, we have to jump to phonics. And good thing about Spoon is if I went off of the most likely percentages, I would be spelling the word correctly, both conventionally and phonemically. So readers need to become orthographic experts by absorbing lots of data with practice, and more practice. So they learn that there's 26 levers, learn that there's 44 phonemes in language, they learn there's 74 common ways of representing those sounds, there's different ways of putting words together to form syllables. It's a journey in the early years of school. They learn their letters, but then learning letters is not enough, because there's different ways to represent sounds that are more complex than just single letters. And those are introduced in a traditional phonics curriculum through those, kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, leading into a little bit of grade 3. So over time, we learn to combine those elements to form words. So maybe we start with what we call Cvc words. The short vowel here, the I is in pin, the A is in mat, and the A is in sap, and the I is in sip. They're fairly regular if they appear in this consonant vowel consonant form. And so if I ask the children, here's these letters, I want you to form as many Cvc words out of those letters, I'd be very confident for a particular group of learners that they'd be able to pronounce any word that they create due to the regularity and stability of Cvc pronunciation patterns based around that short version or first sound of the vowel. And then after that, the first thing to introduce is the silent E, is how does a word change when you put an E at the end. So pin becomes pine and mat becomes mate. And then also introducing that vowels are not only always a single letter, but a vowel can be two. AY saying A, and EE saying E, and oi and I, so day and boil and tree and friend and bread. And then also seeing multisyllabic words. And so we learn patterns of words over time. We learn syllable patterns over words. We learn how to add what we call inflectional endings. If the word doesn't have a final E on it, you double the consonant and add ing. You drop the E and add ing. So hop becomes hopping and hope becomes hoping. Bat becomes batted and look become looked. And so there's a flow chart in adding a suffix or certain rules that have to be taught and understood and mastered with experience. And we also learn about morphology. We learn about prefixes and root patterns and suffixes. So this word apathetic, apathetic, we know that a means not, path means feeling. So the quality of not feeling or not caring. Apathetic means not caring. Philanthropy, phil means love. Anthro means humankind or mankind. So a love for mankind or generosity. And so in addition to basic code patterns, we start to look at how we can interpret meaning by understanding how a word is constructed, particularly in English, and also particularly English words that are based on Latin or Greek sort of roots. So children learn about prefixes later on in a phonics pattern. And so over time, children, pre-spellers before 4 years old, they're not really too conscious and aware of how print works. But in that subsequent period of 4 to 7, they're spelling things as they sound, using invented spelling before they start to learn the conventional patterns within English. And then they start to match not only their phonological knowledge, but also the orthographic knowledge of visual regular patterns in English between the years of 7 to 9. And then between 9 to 11, they start to apply an understanding of particular rules. So if I go here, these are rules of the English language that can be taught, but they're taught later on in the piece. And as one grows older, eventually they go back to dorsal ventral shift hypothesis, mostly spelling things from knowledge. Not spelling things and sounding them out, but I just know that word, and I don't have to sound it out because it's deeply ingrained into my knowledge bank, my memory bank, and that allows me to compose and write more automatically without laborious thought. And so over time we blend components to make words. We blend phonemes and letters and graphemes and syllables, or prefix and roots and suffixes, and we combine those words to make sentences, because the point of literacy is to be able to communicate in the world, but also to understand what other people are thinking through messages conveyed in print. And so this is just another way of representing that developmental pattern of the types of orthographic patterns that a child masters over time, starting with Cvc words, to the silent E pattern, to the double multi-letter vowel patterns, etc. Phonics Sequence. If you have a chance, there's a great source here, Words Their Way, study of phonics, vocabulary, and spelling, and that also provides an idea of what children should be learning at different ages, what a curriculum would focus upon across the schooling experience. And I've also provided, for those who are both watching the video but also downloading the slides, some sources of phonics sequences. One of the open source and free ones is this one down at the bottom, Letters and Sounds, put out by the UK Department of Education and Skills. It's a full phonics curriculum, but as I said, the Words Their Way is a really good and highly thought of resource. And the Beck and Beck Making Sense of Phonics actually has a really good assessment tool as the appendices that allows a learner, or allows a teacher, to understand what patterns a child has mastered and being able to read, and what they still need to develop and learn. So on to automatic word recognition and construction, because these are all just the means to the end. The ends is to be able to, I know that word, I can write that word, I can handle language with ease and skill. And so we want learners to be able to use, read, and spell common vocabulary, high-frequency words, print words that are encountered frequently in books and in the environment, topical words being studied at school like focus words, as well as words based on a progressive pattern in a phonics program. This is just a page of Fry's first most common words in the English language, and then the second most 100 most common words in the English language, and the third most common 100 words in the English language, with a few extra ones thrown in there by myself. And children being able to decode and recognize words in their environment, like monster. If you want to have picture cards such as this, a great source is down here at Text Project. They've got collections of vocabulary cards that can help with learning to integrate those decoding skills into reading full words and more complex words. So going back to Seidenberg, and we're leading fast track towards the conclusion. What's the key prerequisite? Is a proficiency in language, followed by a knowledge of orthographic structure and the relationship between written and spoken language, the ability to recognize quickly a large vocabulary of printed words, to know the meanings of a large quality or corpus of vocabulary words, have a knowledge of phrases and sentence structures, being able to comprehend and compose sentence structures of varying complexity, and to be able to comprehend and compose larger structures such as texts from sequences of sentences. And the ability to read for different purposes, at different depths, and to also develop and continue to develop a rich array of background knowledge and experience as an impetus to want to read and learn, and also an impetus to want to communicate and express. So, what do I want to say in conclusion to all of that? We want learners to rapidly and unconsciously see language through the code, and to use code-based skills to be able to read and access new words and language. And we want fluency to reach such a stage so learners can attend to the more difficult tasks of composing and comprehending messages. We want to monitor key growth in areas such as oral language, cognitive capacity, phonological processing and phonemic awareness, alphabetic knowledge, decoding skills, encoding skills, vocabulary development, fluency, and comprehension. Because as teachers, we should be compelled to talk regularly with learners, for their oral language development, verbal reasoning as well. Read to learners, read with learners, and help readers learn on their own. Write for learners, write with learners, and help learners write on their own. Help them develop those key skills of phonological awareness, decoding, spelling, vocabulary, grammar, fluency, etc. Help them build knowledge about the world, as well as strategies to build their knowledge, and provide them with opportunities to use language and literacy for understanding and action. That could be a key, checklist of what would go into holistic and effective instruction. So, what was the point? We want to illustrate why learners must develop an understanding of patterns in their own language, like phonemic awareness. We want to talk about the elements of the code, to emphasize the ultimate goal of mastering that code, and to say that once that code is mastered, there's still an ongoing development of further language skills, comprehension skills, etc. So feel free to download the slides. Many of the slides are not only just for the video presentation, but also good resources that you can use and abuse. And thank you. If you have a chance, feel free to visit us at theliteracybug.com. Write us an email if you have a question. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to be updated whenever a new video comes out. And I do encourage people to follow us on Twitter, not only to receive updates from the Literacy Bug, but we also use it to share lots of resources in the literacy world and sphere. And usually I'd say I leave that as the end and the thank you, but if I go on, there's an appendices, and the appendices has a bit of an algorithm of encoding and decoding, a mapping of the phonemes in English with possible ways that those phonemes can be represented, some common patterns to be able to form words from letters on the left with patterns on the right, and just some extra resources as so. But again, without further ado, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed and learned something from today's presentation.